Because then they start to understand what you really care about is not what you're saying.
Hello, and welcome to the Schmidt List, the podcast for people dedicated to managing successful projects, developing impactful products, and building engaged teams. And now, here's your host, Kurt Schmidt.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to episode 37. This week, Tendayi Viki joins me. He's the author of The Corporate Startup and managing partner at Benelli Jacobs. He joins me to talk about the myth of the Innovation Lab, which is the title of an article he wrote for Forbes magazine back in April, which got my attention, so I reached out to him. He's in the UK, and I'm not, so we did this over Skype, so there's going to be a couple little audio glitches, but I think it's pretty good. Other than that, I want you to stick around because I've got some really exciting announcements after the show is over. So, without further ado, here's my talk with Tendayi Viki, where we talk about successfully launching, promoting, and managing an innovation lab. And he also shares some tips on how to manage up and across. Tendayi, thank you for joining me on the show today. It is a real pleasure to have you here.
No, thank you for having me. It's a great pleasure for me too. Thank you for having me. Pleasure to be here.
That's great. And so you work a lot around innovation these days, but how did you get started in the work that you're doing? Did you start out as a developer or a project manager or product owner? Kind of where did you get your start in this field?
So I actually came at this sideways, right? I kind of stumbled onto this. I'm a former academic. I have a PhD in psychology. So I spent a lot of my time just teaching at university. I spent almost like 20 years in academia, doing my PhD and then teaching for 12 years. And just as part of that work, because I did work on social identity and maybe sometimes I do some research on creativity, I ended up working at Stanford University as a research fellow. And when I was there, the people that took a really keen interest in me as a person and just kind of bringing me around and showing me the town, showing me Palo Alto, Mountain View, San Francisco, were startup guys. There's kind of a paid forward culture, right, in San Francisco and in that whole Silicon Valley, right? So, and those people took more interest in me than some of the academics that I was visiting at the University of Stanford there. So, and that's basically how I got seduced into getting into this space. Yeah.
See, I find that so interesting because a lot of the people I talk to started in a development side of things or maybe an entrepreneurial side of things. And I think one of the reasons why I love your perspective on the state of how people are going about innovation or agile or any of these sorts of change management systems these days, I think you've got a really interesting perspective on it because of that background. And I can see why people would find the work that you do very valuable. So tell me about the role you're in now. What's kind of the day-to-day like for Tendayi?
I'm kind of in the business of mindset change. So I kind of get hired by a lot of companies to kind of help and to design the tools and artifacts that they can use to do innovation well. So I'm director of product lifecycle at Pearson, which is a global education company. And so I spent a lot of my time with Pearson. We developed a framework called the product lifecycle, and that's what we use to make investment decisions. And that's also the framework we use to kind of design, the practices and the tools that teams can use. I'm a real believer that if you want to change people's minds, you don't just do it by talking to them. You do it by giving them behavioral options around the way you design the tools they use. And then they kind of get to embody the practice that they're trying to kind of, develop as a habit.
Okay, that's great. So let's unpack that just a bit. So you talked about behavioral options. Could you unpack that a bit for me and give me maybe an example of maybe not necessarily a live example, but maybe just an example that we can understand. If I wanted to give some behavioral options to folks instead of just a black and white, do this or do that, where do I start?
So let's take innovation, for example. So I'm working with a lot of leaders that are really concerned that their organization does not have enough great ideas, right? Like, the world is changing and we need our folks to come up with great ideas. So, Tendayi, you wrote a really great book. Can you come and help my team? And then you go into the organization and you say, okay, let's do can I join a couple of your meetings where people are talking about ideas and just see what happens? And then you go into one of those meetings, and if somebody's brave enough in that organization to come up with an idea, after about the first 15 minutes of their pitch, the the leaders start asking them how much money the project or the idea is going to make by year 5. Right. So in that moment, they don't realize that that's the only tool they know how to use in order to make decisions, i.e., rate of return or accounting rate of return or payback period. Those are the only artifacts they have to manage decision making. Mm-hmm. So by just having those tools, they've already restricted people's behavior options, because nobody is coming to you with an idea for which they don't have some ability to project 5 years into the future. And so the moment you do that, it means that you're more likely to be investing in ideas that are similar to products that you already have in your business. And so that's the reason why people aren't bringing you great ideas, because it's limited their behavioral options. So the moment that happens, I'm then able to have a conversation with them just to show them how that's kind of constraining their innovation space.
So, and a part of that, what you're talking about is that managing of stakeholders and the importance of that these days. I'm a firm believer that because of the way that people want to work more iteratively and less like a assembly line, they want to do rapid learning, rapid prototypes, all these different things. That stakeholder management, managing up and managing across, is more important than ever these days. Would you agree?
Completely. Like I completely agree with you. So the example that I just gave you is one half of the equation that I have to deal with. Mm-hmm. The other half of the equation I have to deal with is entrepreneurs who work in large companies that think they're Elon Musk. And so they think that the best way to do innovation is to be swashbuckling and kind of, insinuate that the leaders don't know what they're doing and they're ruining the company and you are seeing the future and you're the savior of the company. They don't say it in exactly those words, but that's the tone that you get. And this idea that, MBAs ruin everything and we should get rid of all the MBAs, that kind of attitude creates an unnecessary tension between leadership and the innovation teams or people that are interested in entrepreneurship. I think stakeholder management becomes really important, because just as important as it is for you to work on great ideas, it is as important for the leader to understand whether you're making progress while you're working on those ideas.
Right. And you talk about measurement in here, and I want to jump into that. But real quick, I want to go over something you mentioned there. One of the things that I've talked about on this show a few times with some folks is about this idea of the innovation lab and how it's this separate thing from the organization. Do you feel that sometimes companies are more comfortable with saying, okay, you want to innovate and you want to do that over here in this controlled environment away from us? That way, you don't explode the rest of the business and you don't take resources from the rest of the business. And we can still go and tell our stakeholders or shareholders or whoever that we are innovating and we got this innovation lab. And I think you kind of referenced it as innovation theater in some points. Do you feel like that's why that happens? Why it isn't more of across an organization?
Yeah. So what's interesting is that, so there's two aspects to that. There's leaders that really want to innovate, but they get a sense that it can't happen in their organization. And so what they want to do is they want to protect innovation, so they move it to a different part of the organization. And then there's a part of it where leaders don't really want innovation, but nowadays it's kind of a politically incorrect. And so you kind of have to play along. And the best way to play along is to put the people as far away from the organization as possible, right, and hope nothing meaningful comes there to kind of disrupt your day job. And I think, if you're the person who is in that situation, you need to understand exactly what your stakeholders' intentions are, because that will determine how you then manage them going forward.
With that management of them, you also talk about innovation labs and the lack of measurement. And like you'd mentioned before, obviously you could just put some arbitrary dollar figure out and say, well, we should be able to scale this up to multi-millions of dollars over the next few years and just placate, a CTO or something like that with those numbers. But what are some ways you've seen measurement work outside of the dollar, the ROI, or the revenue side of things that you've seen work in these situations?
Yeah, so that's what's interesting, right? Is that You could successfully placate the CTO or the CEO with some number today, but if that number doesn't materialize 3 years from now, the lab's going to get closed.
Mm-hmm.
And so, that's one of the reasons why labs get closed. Another one is if the lab is the pet project of the CEO and that lab is not producing any returns, if the CEO gets replaced, the lab is going to get closed.
Right.
So it's really important for innovators to be really thinking about what is true innovation. And to my mind, innovation is this combination of really clever ideas with sustainably profitable business models. So you do want the clever, smart ideas. You do want, the cool, interesting products, but you want them to be sustainably profitable in the sense that they pay for their own life. They're not consistently reliant on the organization to keep funding them, but they're actually generating revenue and profits. So then that raises a question. Well, on day one, there's no way that I can know that my idea is going to be sustainably profitable. Well, how do I get there? And that's where you can then start using lean startup, agile, and design thinking methodologies to solve a few pieces of the puzzle. Who are the customers? Do they have a real need? Have we created a solution that they want to use? Are they using the solution in the way that we expected? Are they willing to pay for the solution in a manner that makes it profitable versus how much it's costing us to create the solution? Are we able to scale it? Are we able to scale this product into the right markets? Have we found the right channels? The more positive answers you get to these pieces of the puzzle, the more likely it is that your idea will be successful. And so what I try and sort of get innovation leaders to do is to create a dashboard that tracks these metrics, the business model innovation metrics, and make that public. For every single idea that they're working on, they can be able to report on which pieces of the puzzle they've solved. We've solved the customer need puzzle. We've solved the solution puzzle. We've solved the channel puzzle. We've solved the price point puzzle, so that leaders at any given moment can see how well the projects in the innovation lab are actually doing, which allows them to make more informed decisions about whether to keep funding you. If you don't show them metrics, they have to keep asking whether they should keep believing your story, which is not a really good place to be when you're trying to lead innovation.
One thing that I've seen work really well in those initiatives is where, as you mentioned, that those metrics and those dashboards being made public to the entire organization, the people that are going to have to support this after you scale it and making them a part of it. One thing that you did, and I want your opinion on that, but one thing you talk about that kind of reminds me of that. I've read something that you wrote on Medium not long ago about the difference between transformation and innovation. So if you're focused on that innovation, do you feel like it needs to be more off to the side and it needs to be kept away from the other group? Or is it more of just a mindset about why are we doing this innovation? Is it to transform the organization or is it to make new lines of business? What are your thoughts?
So that's interesting, right? Because that distinction that I make between transformation and innovation is for the innovator to think about what their job is.
Okay.
So, and both can be an innovator's job. The transformation job is an organizational design job. That's what I do for a living, for example, right? Which is designing the tools and processes that are used to manage innovation, encouraging leaders to adopt and try to use those tools and start to enjoy using those tools, training people and coaching people and transforming decision making and creating those dashboards that I'm talking about that are used to kind of track progress. Now, that's a difficult choice to make to try and transform organizations because changing people is the hardest thing you can do. It is difficult. There'll be a lot of pushback. There'll be a lot of politics. If you're interested in just making cool products, you could potentially do that in an organization that hasn't been transformed. If that's what you're focused on, you then have to figure out a way to nurse your idea. One way to nurse your ideas is to move over to the side and develop your idea in a lab. And other people are really great. I've met some really great innovators that work in like really traditional companies, but they are so well connected and they're so well respected that they've kind of bought themselves the political space to be able to try new things. And so they're able to kind of nurse their idea and protect their idea within the organization. The difficulty for a lot of people is that there's a certain point at which you need a company-level decision about your idea, regardless of whether you're in a lab or whether you're working within the company. At some point, you need a leadership-level decision. And it's usually the point where you need more resources than the resources you can scrape up when you're working in the underground.